walk as if in prayer, and Osrith turned at the crunch underfoot of leaves behind her. It was Andra, a sharp scribe staff in his hand, usually used for pointing out the letters in a manuscript. He was going to use that, Osrith scorned silently. He looked at Osrith, a slight pink to his cheeks, and was about to speak, when Osrith laid a hand on his arm. He looked at it, then back to her. "Did you hear what I told the children?" He nodded. "So," Osrith concluded, "Andra will lead you to the kitchens. You will follow behind him as if you are in Sunday progress in the monastery church." "And after, we get dinner?" asked Neil, his clean on-today breeches already filthy at the knees. "Dinner, for good boys who can walk in prayer," Osrith laughed, trying to make light of it all. "Balachmuth." Then, Osrith turned back to Andra. He was still holding his slave stick, looking at Osrith fixedly. "What is needed is for them to walk," Osrith said, as if they have just learned from the scriptures a most rapturous thing, silently, and with reverence. She leaned close to Andra, her warm breath on his ear. "One scream and the game is up." She pointed back to the library room. "Take your parchments if you must, in fact, even better, carry them so the boys can see you with them, as the abbot does." A minute passed as the group assembled, although for Osrith it seemed like an hour. The battle noise was rising, though no one would be fighting yet. The noise made by the Norse, loud and fierce rhythmical banging on their shields, would be enough to terrify most of the monks. And yet, now, a song was being sung, low, persistent, like a battle horn of war. The holy men wait, singing together, and it sounded as terrifying as the Norse's beating. And, once they were away, Osrith withdrew the sword Tagged had given her, found her battle stance, shifting the blade in her grip, before walking back through the monastic church of St. Comsil as the monks charged up the hill. 88,888,888. It took some minutes for the warriors to appear, through the courtyard, and then fan out around both sides of the monastery, joining in the battle at both periphery. Behind them, mirroring the Norse flag of a hammer and lightning bolt, Domhnall's cross clutched in a red-handed fist stood out proud and clearly in the morning sunlight. Osrith did not see Domhnall at first. He had taken his warriors to the rear of their monks, spreading out and taking strategic positions behind the monks, who, though valiantly fighting, were little match for the Northmen, who were cutting through rows of men like a knife through butter. Finding a place to fight, where the line of Norse looked weaker, Osrith ran at the battle line, stopping short of the shield wall, before sweeping up a part-broken Norse shield, pushing her arm through the back of it and holding fast, as monks surged past her, and were met with weapons and death. Some monks, clearly trained to fight, held back, and a line formed by several of them. The only way to fight was to hold a line, even a part line, and weaken the enemy before making a move to attack and kill. This was the first thing Sainid had taught her, and drilled in her when she trained, back when was king of the Picts and before Domhnall and Constantine had to flee to exile. Even now, a tall, thick-haired youth of a Norseman had Osrith in his sights, to try to misfoot her or goad her into charging on. Osrith managed to twist away and raise the pommel end of Tagged's sword, jabbing it towards his face, which was, as usual for a Northman, unprotected. At the same time, a surge of monks screaming almost as loudly as the Norse as they charged at the left of the line caused some disruption. That section was less disciplined than the rest. It was clear the Northmen had concentrated many inexperienced fighters there. A clatter of metal on wood caused several Norse to go down. Another one before her, Osrith thought, as the young Northman's attention was drawn for a second. Just enough time for Osrith to pull the handle of the axe he was holding from his fingers. The Norse roared as in delight as the monks, untrained and leaderless, met their end to Osrith's right, where the best warriors were positioned, stoic, steady, willing to wait until their enemy was weak before attacking the line, holding, and then massacring the monks. But where she was, Osrith's attack was not enough to break through. Not when untrained men were meeting disciplined warriors. The young Norseman, though disarmed, was not defeated. She could not break through to give the monks who were being smashed either side of her a chance. The Norseman, angry at his mistake as his weapon lay now in the dirt somewhere, forced himself down to hold the line, trying to reach around and grasp the handle of Tagd's sword. Osrith tried to hold fast on ground that was becoming slippery with blood as the man's fingers now added to it. A man behind, with a cudgel, had smashed the young boy, and he was sinking down Osrith's body. Anguished cries accompanied desperately groping fingers, as if begging her for life. She stepped over his form. As she picked up her head, here was the gap, she told herself. She had to be quick or the line would reform and her chance would be lost. A blow to her back made Osrith start and she paused as monks, clearly more experienced than those beneath their feet, took advantage of the breach of the shield wall. Pain lanced up Osrith's back and into base of her skull as she twisted her body away, her old injury from Tara amplifying the blow. A smash of ironware drew Osrith's breath and she turned to face the Norse again. The breach was widening as more Norse were holding back. For what reason, Osrith did not know. Retreat was an anathema to them. The boy, though injured, was not dead. He wobbled, his legs struggling to hold him upright. He grasped the lower edge of his helmet with one hand, adjusting it, and Osrith caught sight of a shadow at the base of his neck. His sword had cut the man after all. Not fatally, but he had drawn blood. Another roar, this time from her left, and now, the monks shouted and screamed a war cry of their own, charging for the Norse again. Osrith looked back to where her wounded opponent lay. Except he wasn't. Staggering back and gripping all he had brought to fight with him, the young man gripped his axe with both hands and charged, baring his teeth bared in a feral grin, ready to enjoy what was about to be the end of her. But he was wrong. Osrith's hand found the end of the axe and managed to pull it free from his grip. The boy's face changed from one of anticipatory triumph to the horror of knowing he was to meet his doom. The axe swept back up and Osrith darted to his left, sweeping the bloody weapon up to slam its handle against the boy's face. But it missed. Instead, ricocheted off the arm of a monk by her side, who crumpled down to her right. She took the advantage, lunging forward as the boy slipped on the monk's blood, which had made the damp earth slippy. It was what Osrith needed. Tagd's sword came up, then thrust down through his ribs, and he slumped forward at her feet. A shout came from behind her as she scooped up the axe, just in time for the next row of Norse to seep into the gaps of the front line, the keen youngsters and those in punishment position, the for a wrongdoing, having borne the brunt of the monks' ferocity. But these were the elite Norse, tall, mighty, determined that today was the day the land of Doio was to be theirs. Yet, behind her, Osrith knew, Flan Sinner would have mobilized his army, Donchard leading the main fighting force, Domhnall with Fergus Tagd, and Domhnall, with his red-handed banner fighting with all his might next to his usurper for the land that was once his father's. Oh yes, they were behind her, but the Norse were in front, long, braided hair shining in the morning's sunlight as they bore down in groups onto the UNA copyright hills, and their fine hair was probably the last most would see as their guts were spilt on St. Columba's earth. And now, one was before her, axe raised, ready to cut her down. Fast, she must he fast. A woman must be nimble to be a warrior, for she could not match a man for strength. Sainid had taught her that Domhnall had, too. Yet, she was slower than she once had been. Why? Dodging left, Osrith was drawn by the laugh of a Norseman to another, clapping him on the back as he failed again to enter. Ragnar, you can do better than that. If only, Canute. Their warrior called Ragnar complained, then turned to make a concerted effort to smash Osrith again, snapping his right hand out, fist driving into Osrith's throat. She'd had worse, but the blow made her throat close. Gagging, she felt her grip on the axe loosen. The Norseman hit her again, and she barely managed to tuck her chin down. His fist scraped across her jaw once, twice. Osrith stumbled back. The man's blow had less energy as she had expected, yet Ragnar the Norseman pressed his advantage further, pounding Osrith with short jabs. They weren't terribly powerful hits, but the flurry of punches kept her off balance, forcing her to retreat. To her left, two monks pressed forward into the space Osrith left, beaten down with 2 strokes by the Norseman Canute. But it was enough to allow Osrith to see a chance. Her opponent, still pushing forward, hitting her around the face, was covered from head to foot with boiled leather and close-fitting mail, but it did not cover the entirety of the palms. At the base of the hand there was a patch of exposed skin. As long as the Norseman held a weapon, it wasn't vulnerable, but without a broken bar. As the Norseman punched her again, Osrith jabbed upward with the tag's sword, held at close quarters, shoving the point into the base towards the man's hand with all of her strength. The Norseman's fist cocked at a strange angle. Osrith felt the knife grind against bone, and she shoved and twisted the blade. The Norseman roared with pain, and Osrith caught a flash of the whites of the man's eyes as her target hit home, before twisting it and pulling back. "Let me finish him, son of Ragnar," Canute insisted, pushing Ragnar aside. Osrith stumbled back, dropping the axe. Canute the Norseman looped his left arm around the Osrith's right, pinning her elbow against her side. Osrith, moaning and spitting, threw her weight against the Norseman, a desperate attempt to overwhelm the man, but Canute dropped his hips and twisted his body around as he swept her right leg back. Osrith tried to stop the throw, but she was too off balance. She was about to fly off his feet, but that all didn't come. What did come was a thrust to the side. A monk had joined their battle. It was Andra. Osrith got one fleeting glance towards him. His eyes focused on attacking Canute, who was still holding onto her arm, causing all 3 to come tumbling down. They crashed to the ground, and there was a bone-snapping crunch as Andra's elbow twisted too far in the wrong direction. Canute rolled off Andra as Osrith, having just rolled away, missing the full weight of the Norseman, the roar of battle filling her ears again. Crouching, she warily regarded her downed opponent while her right hand tried to explore a painful gash in her back, just where it had healed from her fight at Tara. Her hand came away red with blood. She staggered to her feet. She could still fight. Unlike Andra, the monk whom she had pleasured was struggling to turn over, but his brain hadn't quite realized how useless his right arm was. His back had been gouged by Canute's axe and his elbow was bent at a hideous angle. But she had little time to contemplate. Ahead of her, the Norseman, Ragnar, was reeling around for another blow. Tightening her grip on Tag's sword, she approached him. Ragnar fell into an easy stance, axe held ready, exchanging jovial words with Canute, who was fighting a fierce battle now over Andra's body with the heavy-set, older monk who was matching the Norseman blow by blow in front of him, hammer raised. Osrith circled back so Ragnar's axe swing only just missed her. He shuffled, shifting to keep Osrith in front of him when, out of her eye's periphery, Domhnall's red hand clutching cross told her that his men at least had the advantage, on the side opposite the foil. Yet, Osrith knew as much as they had gained ground up here, and equal, if not greater quantity of men, had their backs to the river and were forced into it, being cut down as they went. Despite being exhausted, Osrith steeled herself against another blow from Ragnar. The Norseman held himself with an easy confidence, assured in the superiority of his weapons and armor. His reach was longer than Osrith's. He had no reason to attack first. Osrith would have to get in closer to use Tag's sword and, during that time, the Norseman would have every chance to use his axe. Ragnar and Canute were laughing, however, swapping easy exchanges which, to Osrith, sounded like friendly motivation to drive one another on. Arrogance is good, Osrith thought. It will make him slow down. Ragnar, almost sensing her deduction, leapt forward, his axe dashing it against Osrith's neck. It was a marvelously delivered blow, the weight of the Norseman's body behind it and, like Canute's studied cudgel work on another monk to her right, should have taken her head clean off. But Osrith was faster, and she weaved to the left, the blade scraping her neck, a bleeding wound. Ragnar the Norseman raged at her survival, and Osrith thought of the battle, 2 years before, where she wore Constantine's mail and fought as him, shaming him, but keeping him alive. Would he have been fighting that day? Or would Domhnall and Muir have kept the heir to the Dulriadan and Pictish thrones away from the field? Domhnall had defeated Ivar the Boneless that day, As the Norseman had tried to drive home an attack like this man's, he never had made it, and neither did Ragnar. Because something had made the Norse fighters stop and turn. A sound which rippled up Osrith's spine, stopping her head, as if 1,000 beasts were in their death agonies, as if all the Beansai of the whole of Irian had risen and were writhing in the air all around them. Yet, she knew what was causing it. It was no wonder some of the Norse had stopped fighting. Why, some were looking to the heavens, to the river, to the sea. It was the battle cry of the Dulriadans, of Domhnall, and of Doncharda, a cry of bellowing energy, woo-hoo-hooing in their attack. And they were attacking fast. At the rear of the lines, where the vulnerable, where the weaker warriors were positioned, the attacks were coming. Osrith couldn't see who or from where, but the Norse were bunching into groups, retreating from the monks, who were still continuing to attack. Osrith stopped, bracing herself for Ragnar the Norseman to turn back and continue his attack, but instead he raced away, engaging the Irish who were fighting with ... Osrith strained to see. ... It was Domhnall, with Constantine at his side, and around them, Irish under the banner of a red, right hand, palm facing on a yellow field, such as Osrith had seen in the illuminations that Muir had shown her at Kells. She had seen it in a banner again, at Tara, over the hill of the hostages. It was the Allied. Their cry did not diminish as they fought the Norse, rather it sustained and broke around the ridge on which they were fighting, rolling around the air as if itself alive and part of them. Presumably, though they were the UNA Copyright Hill's bitterest rivals, they had united against an overarching enemy. And, it looked as if that decision was paying off. They were winning. The monks continued their advance behind them, surging uphill, over the bodies of their dead. But Osrith did not advance. Instead, her thoughts turned to the children, who she had sent to safety in the kitchen cellars. Had they got there? She had to know. Stumbling back down the hill, burying an attack from a young Norse boy barely older than she was, before sticking him clean in the guts as he hewled just not clear out of her way, Osrith tore towards the palace. The children. She shouted in Gaelish to the guards, who had drawn in the ramparts around the courtyard. Let me pass. Her yell was to the household guard, who were the royal family's last line of defense should the Norse have broken through the line of defense, which they very nearly had. It's me, Osrith, she added, waving the sword belonging to Taggart. But, this was a mistake. From the wooden cross-sections one of Flansinner's men, hugely built, black, curly hair on both sides of his wide face, launched himself at her. Behind him, Osrith's brain registered what she sought, however, Muir WSS leading the children, unharmed, holding each other's hands, into the palace. That was just before the guard tried to fight her. Instead, Osrith, her job done, crumpled at the knees and fainted. 88,888,888. It was Flansinner's eldest son, the massively built, flame-haired Doncharda before whom Osrith knelt, in the throne room of the palace, 3 days after a decisive rout of the Norse from the lands of Doia. The Norse would be back, there was no doubt about that. But it proved to them, and to any other Irish rival house, that the UNA Copyright Hills were mighty and were formidable, even without the help of the Allied. The children had been safe, that was her last thought, and while the guard had made to pierce her body with his sword when she collapsed before the ramparts, the 2 slaves given the job of guarding the rest had ran at him, pushing him off and bringing her inside. Osrith had sustained wounds, a shoulder injury, making her original one worse, and cuts by her throat and arms, painful but not lethal. Muir had been sent to treat her with Lacentoranane, a balm made of figwort, whose red-brown flowers grew by beeches near Bibbenberg Osrith knew, and whose pungent odour she recognized from the men injured in her uncle's army. Tadg, too, had been to see her, his own shoulder wounded, his head cut so that a good portion of his fair hair was missing. It would grow again, he laughed, when Osrith put her hand up from the brown woolen blanket which Ailey had wrapped around her, touching his temple with her fingers, and he took her hand as recounted how they had watched the monks' defense of their monastery, dedicated to the blessed St. Columba, and they had watched her, too. I thought you were terrific, Tag told her, when she brushed away Domhnall's praise of her. Never be afraid to show it, warriors have much to boast about. He bent to kiss the back of her hand, the rest of his long hair spilling over his face as Osrith glowed that her lord was pleased with her. And it was true, she had held her own against the Norse warriors, against Ragnar and Canute, and against those puppy-like boys eager to fight and gain prestige in battle and who she had cut down, some easily, some not so. Domhnall, later, wet with blood and perspiration, had told her to recover and let the servants treat her, but before she could rejoin Fergus and tagged in Domhnall's company, before she could discover much about the rear attack on the Norse or the plans, Domhnall had to return over the water, or indeed, boil water to imbibe the lily root, an act which was just a process now, a thing to do to get rid of the lethargy and restore her strength. Constantine had found her out to tell her the king sought her presence. He looked how she felt, battered face with a gash down one side of his face and an injury to his leg which looked as if it had been caused by a low, back-swiping sword blow. But he was elated, and told her that it had been Prince Domhnall's strategy to hold back a good proportion of the men, and while the Norse had expected some sort of strike, it was more than enough to lay a great deal of their second row, their elite, down to the mud. And, they had lost no royalty. Domhnall and all of his guards still lived. The queen was unharmed, for the Norse had never made it down the hill to test the ramparts' reinforcements, and the CHRON had done as she had said. Domhnall and Donchada, now step-brothers, now at a peace that suited the UNA copyright ill, probably at the command of the High, working together, for once, had made a great show of their force and, with the aid, had been enough to rout the field of the Norse. But they'll be back, Constantine commented, happily, before giving Osrith the news that her presence was required. When, now, and Constantine had waited for her, watching her pull on her clothes before escorting her to the throne room, before she had time to ask about the children, or indeed the aid. The king had not been present, but Muir had been, standing beside her stepson with her other two sons, Domhnall and Neil, at her side. What was it they wanted? The question darted like a minnow through Osrith's brain, and a feeling of panic began to build, as she stood there in the ever-increasing moments of silence. Had they discovered that she had pleasured Indra? Was her pregnancy discovered? But Donchada, who had looked across her short, golden hair, that which he himself had taken, and which Osrith had taken care to maintain to embed the idea of her warriorness, who sat before her. Feeling that it was necessary, Osrith knelt and bowed her head. You have proved yourself, Donchada said, his voice warm and, for once, was smiling. You kept the children safe, you schemed to make them calm and put them in a place few men would have dreamed to look. The boys would most certainly have been killed if they had remained at the monastery, and the girls taken for whores. We owe you our deepest gratitude. The prince took a step towards her, hand outstretched to help her to her feet. Osrith took his warm hand and felt herself smile. My father away to the aid to discuss terms of a potential treaty, such was our victory against the Northmen, or he would be here to give you this. He returned her smile. Osrith watched as, in the morning sunlight, glancing through the wooden window holes, its light played on a blade. Not just any blade, but the one she had won at the competition at Dara. She flicked a glance across to Domhnall who, for once, did not glare foully at her, for it had been his man she had beaten, Domhnall who she had shamed, and he had almost avenged himself in her on that night had his new stepbrother not intervened. They attack because of hunger, Donchada continued, and Osrith realized she had not been listening to the prince. My father's strategy against the Northmen and rid them from Irian is to deprive them of trade and only deal with Christians. He is to recognize King Sign A tilde inverted exclamation mark L as the king of the Allied territories and desist his claim for their lands in return for Sign A tilde inverted exclamation mark L's desistance in claims on Emain Makkah. Clearly, this information was for her and Constantine's benefit, for both Queen Muir and Domhnall looked impassive. So, a ceasefire of both warfare and territory claims while they combined their forces to starve out the Norse. She supposed it could work. Yet, From what she had seen of L's sons and what they were capable of, on the beach, losing her father's sword preventing them from castrating Constantine, a lot of historic enmity would have to be put to one side. Besides, would Domnall and Constantine be here too? Or Domnall for that matter? Would they be recommencing their own blood feud against King Eochaid and Giric the usurper? And a second thought struck, what of the pagans? The heathens Bethu and Little Finn. They were no Christians. Were they to be starved out too? Again, we thank you, Don Shada said, his hair orange as his father's, catching the light as he held it out the sword to her. Osrith took it, looking at it as a mother might her infant. Beautifully inlaid with garnets as the scabbard was, it was nothing to the blade, whose steel, beaten over and over by a blacksmith who knew his trade, who had formed wavy patterns like a stormy sea through it. Though she hated to admit it, the sword was better quality than her father's had been. Bué, she said quietly, echoing the words she had heard on the hill, as the keen imp faded to nothing. Bué bué bué, victory, victory, victory. And victory she was. Don Shada burst into the same hearty laughter as Flancina so often did. We have a name, he declared, his mirth filling up the throne room. Their warrior has declared its name. He clapped her on the back, before adding that the copyright hills were happy to have warriors such as Osrith. Yet, Osrith thought to herself, as she strode next to Constantine, towards the stables, to see Domnall at last, her mind filled with Ethne and Finolai. She was useful to the Irish Gaels. Ethne had not been, she was in the way of Flancina and high kingship. Yet, she was their kin. And Domnall had been forced to lose his lover in exchange for support to reclaim the Gaelish and Pictish thrones. Their lives were nothing to the royal family, except for use or to discard. Mary was brilliant, Constantine told Osrith as they paced through the mud of the courtyard. She sang to the children, fed them, saw them to bed. She even covered the doors with fleeces to muffle any noise they made. Era too, he added. And, for the first time in a long time, Constantine's beaming face seemed, in that autumn evening's sunlight, to glow. Perhaps he was now, thought Osrith, accustomed to his future, accepting of his marriage, and that of his cousin. As they got to the light of the stables, lit with lanterns at the one end, Osrith turned quickly as she heard footsteps. Constantine turned too, and they both looked at the figure of Prince Domnall, who must have followed them from the throne room and who now looked between both of them. Osrith found her hand was twitching down towards Bué. He looked at Osrith, a strange expression on his long, pale face, before waving his arm towards her sword. It was well deserved, he declared, nodding towards her. You fought better than some of the men I have in my army. For a woman, I am not a woman, I am a warrior, Osrith replied, impassively. You look like a woman from where I'm standing. So ye are, he retorted. Pity you had to have 4 men hold me down to find out. Osrith's hand curled around her sword hilt. The metal was cold against the warmth of her palm, and she could just so easily bring it out, naked, and take the young man's life for what he had tried to do to her. Constantine, sensing her anger, took a step towards his cousin to stand between them. And then Osrith loosed Bué. She realized that Domnall's expression was not a hostile one. It was what she had once seen in Sainid's eyes, and Domnall's face, though never in Constantine's. The copyright prince was looking at her with respect. She loosed Bué's hand. In her mind, pity replaced defense. Don Shada was in a good mood, considering he lost so many men, he opined, as Osrith considered the prince again, and a pang of sorrow caught her throat. Domnall had been the heir to throne, but his mother had remarried Flancina to solidify the northern and southern copyright His whole life had changed. His sister had been enslaved for the good of his family, for she had been Flan's first wife. If she had lived, her presence would have factioned the copyright rather than united them. The Norse would have won and the palace and the monastery would have been a smoky ruin. Not as many as we thought, Domnall replied, stepping past Constantine and continuing towards the stables. Osrith followed, as did Constantine. Clearly, he was still set on going with Domhnall. But considering what his father's done, it's a wonder he can smile at all. He is very fond of his sister. Considering ... Gormalayath. Constantine's sentence trailed to nothing. You mean you don't know? At the pine-slatted door of the stables, Domhnall paused in the act of pushing it open. Behind him, horses at rest HMMPPPHHHD and snorted at the minor disturbance. He grinned, but there was no humor in it. Dangerous ground, that's what King Flann is dreading, Domhnall continued. The King of Munster, a man who has been our loyal ally for so long, had wanted her not a year ago for his bride. Flann refused. And now he eyed Constantine as if his cousin was having him on, and he knew you really don't know what she is to marry the younger of Sign A tilde inverted exclamation mark L's sons. He shook his head, bitterly. You know of whom I speak, Constantine, he added. Osrith knew too. They had nearly caught her too, and do heaven knows what. Oh, she would have fought them, but they would have offered no mercy. And she suspected they would have enjoyed making her die slowly. Osrith looked at Constantine, who nodded. They are southern Uineal. They don't understand about the Alate, the years of trouble, of taking out livestock, our women, the perpetual war of belligerence. Willing to give over his daughter like, Domhnall broke off, and turned his head. Then, looking into the stables, strode into it.